Back again for another around the table discussion on NorthstarNews.com. I'm Walter Fields, executive editor of NorthstarNews.com, coming to you from our nation's capital.
And happy Sunday to everyone. I'm Rob Tarver, general counsel for NorthstarNews.com.
You know, one of the hot topics in America today is a state of public education, K through 12 schools. And as you can see on the screen, we have our education reform page up from NorthstarNews.com. We can find news and columns and editorials on the issue of education. Actually, the first column listed is a piece that I wrote called "The Campaign to Destroy Public Schools." And I wrote that piece because what we are witnessing today is an all out assault on public education. And we're seeing it in a number of ways. We're seeing it in a number of ways. And, part of this is the result of how right wing conservatives have decided that their plan of attack will be to go through local school boards. And they're doing it in multiple ways. And they're doing it in ways of trying to control curriculum, erasing the history of Blacks and Latinos and Indigenous people from curricula. They're doing it in terms of trying to control what teachers can say in the classroom regarding race. And it's been a very contentious battle thus far in many local school districts. So today we're just going to talk a little bit about K through 12 education and why this may seem so distant from the nation's politics. It really serves as the foundation of our democracy, and that if we lose public education, we lose our democracy. And you see these articles popping up every day, Rob, in the newspapers. And we've been in a couple of these battles, so we know what it's like on the ground when you have forces that will do whatever is necessary to try to make sure we erode public education. And the children who are going to get hurt most look like us.
That's absolutely true. This slow march toward the destruction of public education has been going on for a long time. It started way back with the advent of charter schools. And I'm not saying there's anything necessarily wrong with charter schools, but from their inception and the use of trying to separate Black students, Latino students from other students to not to fund the public schools, but to make sure that they overfunded the charter schools. Basically, it was a way of separating students and undermining public education. Now, we also had charter schools that did very well for our communities, but by and large, that wasn't I don't believe that was the full plan. So that not working, we then got to the point now where they have made some very conscious decisions, as you said, to basically overtake school boards. And that's why it's really important that we begin to really discuss the formulation of a plan of our own to deal with this. Because as you said, education is fundamental. You and I have worked tirelessly. We've brought suit against districts. We've participated in plans to try to assist districts in making sure that Black students were taken care of, making sure that Black students were supported. And so we've seen firsthand how this happens. But, one of the big places to look at, as it is in almost all of America and all of the assaults, is the state of Florida. Because Florida is basically a cornucopia, a smorgasbord of education assaults. You see it started with the recording of K to 12 teachers, where they said we're going to record them so the parents can now look and see what they're doing. They then went with the "Don't Say Gay" bill, So it was assault to make sure that you didn't have any discussions about LGBTQ community. And now they've started to rewrite Black history. And you know what they say, Walter? Whoever controls history controls the future. And they know this. And that's why they've been so aggressive in taking care of that.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things we have to realize is that they have effectively used smokescreens. And I say they, I mean right-wing conservatives. So the attack may not seem direct, but you have to read between the lines. So the assault on critical race theory, a construct that was never taught in K through 12 schools, is basically something that is, discussed in law schools or schools of public policy. And critical race theory was never a part of K through 12 curriculums. But right-wing conservatives use that as a bogeyman and as a way to strip the teaching of Black history or a truthful accounting of history
Mm-hmm.
out of curriculum. And then you have things like in the state of Texas, where they now have a law that you must have an "In God We Trust" poster in every school. And so they're obliterating the line between church and state, because part of this is caught up in white Christian nationalism,
Absolutely.
infiltrating public schools. Then you have the assault on teachers, where they could not mention race in discussions in classrooms. And so what it has really done is put a lot of pressure on teachers who are already under a lot of pressure. It has resulted in many teachers leaving the teaching profession. We have this widespread teacher shortage in America right now, where you have some school districts that just don't have enough teachers to fill the classrooms. But the bottom line is that it is a very slow chipping away and erosion of our public education system, where the majority of Black and brown students are still educated. And what that means is it will dry up the pipeline of kids, eligible kids, who will go on to college, who will get college degrees. So when we really start talking about the wealth gap in America, it's clear college may not be for everyone, but those with a college education fare better economically over the span of their lives than individuals who don't have a college degree. So, we've been talking a lot in this country about inequality. Well, how are we ever going to get to level the playing field if Black children aren't educated? And this has been an attack that has been carefully designed and plotted. And while it's mostly happening in southern states, some of this is also happening in northern states and far
Yeah.
west states.
Mm-hmm.
And people need to understand, and don't be fooled by this claim of we're fighting for parents' rights. They're not fighting for the rights of Black and brown parents. They're fighting for the rights of a very narrow, right wing, conservative clique of parents who are attempting to not only privatize public education, but to make public education, a tool of white Christian nationalism. That's why
Yeah.
you have in Texas this idea of putting these posters in. And people better wake up, because part of this is these are your tax dollars that are now being used against you.
There
And
is.
and I don't think we look at it like that.
Yeah. No. No. We don't. We don't. We tend to separate all these factors, but we have to realize how interwoven they are. For example, the Supreme Court decision on being able to kneel and pray in the middle of a football field. People looked at that in the abstract. And unfortunately, many Black Christians supported that decision. But they don't realize that that is just a stepping stone toward inserting white Christian nationalism into our schools' curriculum. So that's how it begins. It begins with the short step and then moves forward to something that's much, much greater. But you were talking about the differences between the Southern and the Northern. It may be overt in the Southern schools and the Southern school districts, but in the Northern districts, it takes a very different shape and form. It takes a shape of underfunding and for failing to provide the funding and the resources that our urban schools, which is where we tend to be concentrated as Black students, our urban schools and urban areas need to be able to perform. And so this is not by accident. There's no accident going on here. This is very clearly a strategy. And one of the things that the Republicans and right wings have been very good at doing, we've discussed this before, is messaging. So when they talked about what you talked about with critical race theory, people get these buzzwords in their mind. And if you've seen it on social media where they've asked the people, what do you think about critical race theory? They can't even tell you what it is because it's far more complex than just the idea of teaching certain materials about Black people. So one of the things that we have been talking about, you and I, is what's the strategy for us moving forward as people of color? What do we need to do? Because this is really an uphill battle at this point. The right wing has gained a significant and serious foothold on our education system. They are organized. And more than anything, they come out to the school board meetings. They show up, they vote, they run for these offices. And because they do that, they're able to insert themselves into these positions. What do we need to do, Walter?
Well, I think, I want to go back to something that you were talking about in terms of, religion in schools, because part of this is education. It actually is education, educating our people. I've heard many blacks who are of the Christian faith, and I am one of them. My cross is on. Um, who say, "Hey, all we need to do is put prayer back in schools." And I remind them that when prayer was in schools, we had Jim Crow and we had black people being beat up in the streets because they
Mhm.
wanted their voting rights. And that Supreme Court decision on prayer in schools didn't outlaw prayer in schools. It said that school as an institution cannot lead students in prayer, but students themselves as individuals can pray in school. If students wanted to get together before the start of the school day and have a little prayer circle, that's allowed, so long as it's not a sanctioned
Yeah.
activity by the school. And I think part
And
of this is
forced prayer is not prayer at all.
exactly, exactly. And who are you praying to? So if you're at a school and you have a large Muslim student population and you're going to make them say a Christian prayer, that's offensive. And so I think part of what we have to start is at a very basic level, educating people about how K through 12 education is set up. People blindly send their children out the door every day into a school building without understanding the politics of local school districts, without understanding the power of boards of education, without understanding how their school district is financed through real estate taxes, through their state. And so you have income inequality embedded in our public education system. Those individuals who live in areas where property values are high, those areas will be able to spend more on their public schools in areas where property values are low. So you have many urban areas across the country that have low property value. When I say low property value, I mean assessed value. I'm not saying that the property there is not as valuable as any other place, but it's assessed at a lower rate,
Tax
which,
value.
yes, which yields a lower tax value. So those school districts are really handicapped in the manner in which they can support public schools. And that's why in many of these states you have all these equalization formulas trying to bring these school districts up with state aid so that they can be competitive. But most folks in our community, most parents in our community, never engage at that level. Most parents in our community simply send your child into a public school building and hope for the best,
Yeah.
and only engage if something happens to their child. So you're right. You go to Board of Education meetings, there are no parents in the room while they're passing policy that impacts their children. We come from the state of New Jersey. State of New Jersey did something very progressive decades ago. They passed the Amistad Law, which mandates that Black history must be taught in school. There are only a handful of school districts where that's being done because we don't hold school districts and the state accountable. We simply trust,
Hmm.
and by trusting, we have really surrendered the fate of our children to systems that are not structured to advance their interests. Yes, some Black students do great through their public school education. Many of those that do only do great because they had parents who fought for them. And the same thing with teachers. We always talk about we want good teachers in the classroom. But how can you get good teachers if you don't pay them?
Right. Right.
Our teachers are woefully underpaid. Probably the most important profession, bar none, in this country. This is a profession that is training people who will become citizens, who will then hopefully be able to have the financial means to be very contribute to communities in a number of ways, right?
And the intellectual means to be able to actually move forward with an agenda that benefits society.
Actual, absolutely. All the innovation, right? We talk about innovation. Tomorrow there's this unmanned launch to the moon. Like, where is the next generation of thinkers coming from? Black and brown thinkers coming from if public education crumbles. So I think the answer to your question in a long, very long-winded way is what we're talking about today. Education. We have to go back to some real grassroots education and mobilization, a thing that worked during the civil rights movement when they were bringing people together in churches, in Mason halls, and basically teaching people about government. We have all this technology now, and we're using it right now that can be used to educate folks. We're not doing any of that.
Yeah, because our organizations, the church, the other organizations that we used to have, the NAACP and others, and it still exists to a certain point, but they've broken down. You don't have people with a high participation level in any of those things. You know, the church participation is way, way down. It was already down before the pandemic. Now it's down even more. So we have to begin to develop these new systems of communication and new systems of community. And that's why, social media is actually so important. We're already developing community, I think, in an entertainment way. We can get together for entertainment on, if I remember the old Earth, Wind and Fire versus the Isley Brothers and how much everyone talked about, hey, we're going to have this on social media. Well, you can do the same thing for political and other causes as well. And we got to start generating that whole thing. But one of the things I think we need to really touch on is what are they really going for here? I think we need to be very clear that there is the end game here is indoctrination. They want to indoctrinate our children with a different version of history, with a different version of America, with a different version of what so-called patriotism and Americanism means. And in doing that, they are teaching revisionist history. I talked before about the state of Florida, where they talk about the African slave trade, but they don't mention any of the brutality of slavery. They phrase it as if it was a partnership between the slave and the slave owner. And it just completely changes the entire view of what slavery was. And again, if you control that history and you suggest that this was some sort of partnership, that we were in partnership with white Americans when they brought us over here, that slavery was not that bad, that it wasn't a horrendous institution, then you're left with a different impression of where Black people are today. You would have no understanding of how we were deprived of our rights for so many years and the rights to be full Americans and even human beings.
Well, see, I think indoctrination is part of it. I think the end game is to kill public education as an institution. The history of public education is wrapped up in our struggle. After Reconstruction, it was blacks in the South who were demanding an education. That's how public education systems came into existence. At one point in this country, we didn't have public schools. After Reconstruction, blacks said one of our demands, during Reconstruction, one of our demands was we want our children educated. And in the South, they started to create these public schools. And then you had white philanthropists. You had these Rosenwald schools where they were giving money to build public schools.
Mm-hmm.
I think the end game is we're going to kill the public education system because then the only option you will have is either a network of private schools, private slash parochial schools. And remember, many parochial schools have been dying over the last 2 decades. The Catholic school system has been dying. Or you'll have charter schools, which creates a very difficult entry point for a lot of black students because what they'll do is they'll cream. They will take the black students who are high grade, the top of their class.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody else, too bad. We're not going to admit you. So I think the end game is no more public schools because the complaint has always been that when you look at systems like Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Chicago, Detroit, that we're wasting all this money on public education. And I think that at the end of the day, they want to cut off that feeding of public school districts with tax dollars and shift it in a way that they privatize it. It's no longer going to be a public good. It's going to be a private commodity that if you can afford to send your child to one of these alternative routes for education, then you'll be fine. If not, you're screwed.
You're right.
And so when you look at now, I do think the indoctrination is part of the process, because part of what you get along the way, sort of indoctrination is sort of the side benefit, right? As we continue to destroy public education, we're going to take the time to indoctrinate children so that they don't have a truthful understanding of the society in which they live. Right. So you have these black and brown children who will never hear the stories of slave rebellions. We think about, unfortunately for many of us, we think about black history. We only think about it in the context of, George Washington Carver, Dr. King, Malcolm X.
Right.
There's so many layers to our history, that predate the transatlantic slave trade, right? Our children never hear about that. And so you're going to have a generation of children that we're going to get back to the day when children are going to respond to their own history and culture the way the children did when Dr. Kenneth Clark did the baby doll experiment for the Brown litigation, where you hold up a white baby and a black baby, and all the black kids wanted the white baby,
Yeah. Yeah.
because that's what they saw of value. So I agree. I think the indoctrination part is um the first stage, and they're working hard on that. Like when you look across the country, they're really working hard to strip black history from curriculum, to make sure that teachers, can't talk about race
Yeah.
in the classroom. The
And one of the
banning
most frightening
books.
things, one of the most frightening things is this. I was going to call it book burning, but it's practically book burning. It's book banning. The
Yes.
fact of the matter that we're now removing books from school libraries, and actually across the country, we are now attempting, and say we as Americans, certain sectors of America, are now attempting to close public libraries, to actually deprive people of the right to be able to access public material. This huge amount of public material that's available or should be available to everyone. And those are the types of efforts that we really have to start paying attention to, because these things are not happening in the abstract. They are all sequential pieces moving toward a change in the mindset of Americans. And this kind of dovetails in what we talked about last week, because we talked about Black people, Latinas, being used in such a way by the right wing to be able to further their agendas. It makes it easy for you to be used if you don't understand your history. If you don't understand your history, you begin to believe that we are in this position because of our own difficulties, our own fault, and our own ability to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. And so the American story, they would love to blend the so-called American immigrant story with African American story. They're not the same. As you know, we are not immigrants in that sense. We are foreign natives. We didn't come here because we decided that this was a better land for us. By and large, we came here because we were forced, and that's one of the things that we need to continue to amplify. I love the way that the Jews continuously say, "Never forget." We tend to always want to forget because we're ashamed of the experience. But we can't be ashamed of the experience. We can't be ashamed that we were taken advantage of. We need to celebrate who we are and the fact that we've made it through this far.
Well, I think the issue of books speaks to such a deep issue in America. When you look at, I'm looking at your shelf with books. I got books behind me. I used to live in my local public library as a child. My Saturdays were spent between the stacks in my public library, sitting on the floor, reading books, bringing books home. I fell in love with reading, and I also fell in love with discovering things about my people. And I know what that meant for me as a black child growing up in a predominantly white community and going to, predominantly white schools. There was this sense of pride, there was a sense of presence
Hmm.
that allowed me to withstand, some things that can destroy a child's confidence along the way. And so when you start to ban books, and understand they're banning books mostly by black authors or
Yeah.
by LGBTQ authors, like it's clear who they're trying to keep away from this generation of children. And, when you have a situation where children can go through K through 12 education, get a high school diploma, and have never had a black teacher or read a book by a black author, what does that say to that child? It says there is nothing of value in this country that looks like me,
Exactly. Exactly.
plain and simple.
Hmm.
And so the whole notion of how do you then convince that child that I can be a Rob Tarver? I can go to law school and get my law degree. That becomes such an abstract idea because if you've never heard about Charles Hamilton Houston or Constance Baker Motley or Thurgood Marshall, how can you fix your sight on I can be a lawyer too, like them? And it's a very wicked thing that's being done to our children in these public schools when you see this movement to really become this ahistorical institution. My professor at NYU, God rest his soul, Dr. Walter Stafford, my mentor, he was coming up with this theory that he called the conspiracy against memory. He said what we really have in this country is a conspiracy against the truth. It's a conspiracy against historical memory. They want to wipe the memory of what was done to us and who
Hmm.
we are from our narrative. And more, you're seeing this almost um, panicked effort on the part of the right wing to do this. And it's tied up with demographic change in America, the fact that they're looking at the numbers, the fact that they know in short order people of color are going to be the majority. So, how do we keep folks in their place? Well, we kill their history. We make sure that they never have the confidence that they can lead, that they can excel in all these professions despite our history of overcoming. They want to make sure that this generation of children has no idea about the value their culture has brought to this country and how their culture is the culture on which this country is built.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And what I urge, if we have to leave everybody with anything at all, I would urge people who are listening to be very clear about your obligation, whether or not you have a child in a district, to be a part of those school board meetings, to be a part of those school board elections, to make your voice heard. Because the fact of the matter is really what it's about. It's about generation shaping and
Yes.
recognizing that if we're not there, if we're not participating, if we're not taking a seat at the table, then we're not going to get fed, or we're going to have to eat what somebody else wants us to eat. And that's really what this is all about. It's about us having to eat what somebody else wants us to eat. And that's where we are right now today. So I would just urge everyone to really just take a step back, take a look and figure out where these meetings are in your community and get there.
And you're so right because this is about shared responsibility. This is about as a community, we make the decision that the education of our children will be a priority. When we were growing up, even though we had parents who were involved, who supported us, there were also other adults in our community who looked out after us, made sure would say something as simple to me coming home from school. How was your day in school? Like, what did you learn in school today? We don't do that anymore. And we have become very siloed in the way in which we operate in our community. This has to become something that Black adults, whether you have children or not, whether or not your children have graduated from a K through 12 system. We have to make the determination that no matter what, the education of our children is critical, and that we will do what is ever necessary. If you're not a parent, you are still supporting a public school district because your tax
Yeah.
dollars are going to that public school district. So the idea that you don't want to go to a board of education meeting because I don't have any children anymore in the school district. Well, guess what? They're spending your money no matter what. And I think the idea that we always talk about, it takes a village. This is this could be no truer point when it comes to public education. If the village doesn't step up, our children will not receive an education.
Yeah.
Because if the thing that parents worry about most, and this is where if you're a non-parent, you can contribute some of your voice and power. Most parents worry that if I speak up, my child will be targeted in this school district. They'll come after my child. That's why those of us without children and have nothing to lose, so to speak,
Mm-hmm.
we need to step in to that fold and stand up for these children so that those parents that do have children in the school district don't feel as though that there is a downside to being heard or voicing their opinion about what's going on in our public school districts.
Yeah, yeah. Being a parent who's dealing with a child that's either being discriminated against or has some kind of problems in the school system, that is the loneliest place to be today in America because there really are no very real resources. And when we began what's called the Black Parents Workshop, that was to address those types of situations. And we've been deluged, flooded with all of these calls for help from parents who have children who are under siege here. And so, when we talk about strategies, the other part of strategies is for those of us who are professionals and have some expertise also to be able to step up and be able to defend our children as they go through this school process. And it's not always about being paid. It's not always about getting some sort of compensation. We have people who are in dire trouble, and just like you wouldn't ask to be paid in order to save a child who's in trouble, that's exactly what this is about. We have to begin to get back to the idea of community as professionals and say there are things that are bigger than our wallet. There are things that are bigger than us. And I say that particularly for attorneys, because we have a specific skill to be able to deal with the legal nuances and problems of these things, but we don't do it. We just don't step up. And this is one of the things I challenge not just local attorneys, but the National Bar Association, other organizations who are made up of attorneys who are well qualified to deal with these types of things. We have to start coming together as community and start acting like we belong to one another here.
Absolutely. And the effort that you talk about, that we've been involved in, grew out of the experiences of my wife and I trying to support our daughter, and just realizing that what she was experiencing in this one particular public school district was being experienced by a lot of black students. And that understanding that we weren't necessarily waging a fight. And at that time it was through the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights with the assistance of the ACLU. I knew that we weren't waging a fight just on her behalf, that we were really going to have to confront the systemic beast out there of inequality and discrimination in a K through 12 public school system. And it is vitally important that when you enter into these battles, that you have competent legal counsel that understand not only federal law, federal civil rights law, but also state law, because most of these issues are going to be confronted through your state constitution. Whatever your state constitution says in terms of the provision of public education, that's what's going to matter. And so, I think, your advice to lawyers is absolutely correct. We need black and brown lawyers who will step up and will assist parents to confront the discrimination that their children are experiencing in school districts on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. we have a special mandate because it is out of education that our struggle really progressed. You know, people want to look at Brown versus Board and hail that Brown versus Board case as something that's seminal and important, but it took 30 years of groundwork going to different places across the country in order to make that happen. And I say that simply to say that we were these things are not going to be accomplished overnight. They're not going to be accomplished overnight, and they're not going to be accomplished without hard work. Hopefully, we're raising a generation of young people who are willing and ready to do the work, because that's what it's going to take. We're up against some tremendous, tremendous odds. I don't know if you saw the gentleman, what's his name, Leo, who donated $1.6 billion to right-wing causes. They are well-funded, they are well-staffed, and they have people who are specifically dedicated, attorneys and public policy people specifically dedicated to destroying your rights. You know.
And I'm going to end on this note because we've run out of time, but I'm going to go back farther than those 30 years. We have to understand that the thing that could get an enslaved black person killed the quickest was being found out that you were trying to learn to read, right?
Yeah,
So going back to the period of slavery, it was clear that education was the pathway to freedom. And so if you had the audacity to try to learn to read, there was one or two things that were going to happen to you. You were either going to be physically brutalized or you were going to be killed, because folks understood that if they can learn to read and if they can get educated, they will no longer accept slavery as a condition.
exactly.
And we have the same, challenge today, because again, we have a different type of oppression that we experience in America's black and brown people. And the key to our liberation is knowledge and education. And so we can't lose sight of that. But this is not just a one session conversation. We're going to have to revisit this. We have a few people that we will invite to be a part of this ongoing discussion about public education, because folks, this is the battle that is before us right now. For so many years, I've heard that education is the new civil rights battleground. It is now, and it is in front of us. And if we don't fight, we will lose, and our children will be irreparably harmed by it. So until next time, this is Walter Fields, executive editor of NorthstarNews.com.
You know what, Walter? I can't leave without making your viewers, our viewers, aware of this. Many decades ago, before George Floyd, there was a young man, Philip Pinnell, New Jersey, who was killed in a brutal fashion by police in the town of Teaneck, New Jersey. There is a series that's coming up on MSNBC. It's going to be broadcast in September. Walter, you played a significant part in the quest for justice for Philip Pinnell and his family. And Walter, I know you're going to be found prominently featured in that particular on those episodes. So I want to make sure our viewers, our listeners, get a chance to make sure that they tune into that. It's MSNBC. I'm going to be teasing it for the next couple of weeks. It's coming out in September. But I'm Rob Tarver for NorthstarNews.com.
Absolutely. Have a good day, folks.